My name is Jens Christian Hermansen. I am the editor of Kosmos, a quarterly magazine about spiritual science. I believe in the value of open-minded and critical thinking. I'm in London to meet Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. We are going to talk about science, God, and visions for the future. Sheldrake is a renowned British biologist. He's the author of more than 80 scientific papers and 10 books. He has previously been ranked among the top 100 global thought leaders. But he is also a controversial figure. He is part of a group of scientists and philosophers who are currently exploring the intersection between science and spirituality. Rupert Sheldrake, I'm so pleased that you've given us some of your time today. In your recent book, you described that you were raised in a Methodist family. Later you went on to university, to Cambridge University, where you studied biology. At a certain stage, you became an atheist. I believe that you joined an atheist organization of some kind. Today, you are no longer an atheist. You've just published a new book, this one here, Science and Spiritual Practices. You've previously written on the different dogmas of science, and you've been called the most controversial scientist on earth. How would you describe your own journey?
Well, I've had a journey, both a scientific and a spiritual journey. When I was at school and at university, the scientific journey was the predominant one, and that itself was not straightforward because I did biology because I loved animals and plants, and then I found that the main thing we do when studying them is kill them and look at dead animals and plants, and I from an early age wanted to find a better kind of biology, something more about life than about death, more about the holistic properties of organisms than about the reductionist aspects of them. So that was a major concern of mine, and that part led to the development of my hypothesis of morphic resonance of memory and nature, and doing research in areas of biology that are perhaps rather beyond the mainstream, trying to broaden out the whole subject. So that's one strand. The other is the spiritual strand, and I went through this atheist phase, and that really came into question when I was traveling in India and in Sri Lanka, which I did first in 1968. And I found cultures there with ways of understanding that were completely unfamiliar to me, yet which were very attractive and made sense. Then I discovered psychedelics, and that again had a literally mind-opening effect on me. Then I took up meditation and yoga. And then I had a chance of a job in India, so I went back to India. I lived there for 7 years, working in an agricultural institute. And my path there was mainly following Hindu philosophy, and I had a Sufi teacher as well. But finally, I came back to a Christian path, to my surprise, and I spent 2 years living in an ashram in South India with an English Benedictine monk called Father Bede Griffiths, which for me was a most wonderful experience. I wrote my first book, A New Science of Life, staying in Father Bede's ashram.
When I read your new book, Science and Spiritual Practices, I sort of get the impression that you want to defend religion in a way. Meditation, gratitude, prayer, and so on are not just old dogmatic practices. Do we need religion today?
Well, some people find they don't need religion, and in Western Europe, a majority of people don't need it. In Britain, a survey in 2017 showed for the first time that most people, 51% of the population, said that they were not religious. They had no religion. Well, ask them whether they need religion and they'll say no, because they're living lives without it. Now, the question is, would their lives be better if they did have spiritual practices? And to that, I think the answer is yes. There's now a lot of scientific research that shows that people who have regular religious or spiritual practices, on the whole, are healthier, happier, and live longer. They're less prone to depression, less prone to addiction. They have better social supports. They have more satisfying lives. So I think that basically what this research shows is that spiritual practices have great benefits. The converse is that not having spiritual practices has disadvantages. Personally, I think that militant atheism should come with a health warning, because if people give up all their traditional religious practices and don't adopt other spiritual practices in their place, I think their lives on the whole are going to be poorer, less satisfying, and just simply less happy.
I often hear people say, I'm interested in spirituality, but I'm not religious. And what they mean by that is something like this. Well, they are interested in spiritual questions, but they don't feel that they belong to a particular religious tradition with its dogmas and so on. They consider themselves to be modern and open-minded. They're interested in science and so on. But at the same time, they are not completely satisfied with science. There is a sort of spiritual hunger that's not being satisfied. So where do they go? What's your message to that group of people?
Well, you see, I think that that's a very natural response. Most people who've been educated in European universities have been alienated from the Christian tradition. The Enlightenment intellectuals were deeply anti-Christian. The French Revolution abolished Christianity in France for a while, and replaced it with the cult of reason. That happened during the Reign of Terror, 1793. And so the modern secular educational institutions, in a sense, grew up in opposition to the Christian church, and often, although some of them were Christian foundations, the intellectual tone is anti-Christian and anti-religious. So most people have grown up with a view of religion, a very negative view of religion. They see it as dogmatic, restrictive, causing conflicts, and so on. But it's a very one-sided view, because, first of all, religions traditionally, and when they flourished most, like Christianity did in the Middle Ages, there were all these monasteries and convents. There were people having mystical experiences all over the place. There were miracles, there were pilgrimages, there were holy wells, and so on. Now, Protestantism stripped all that away, so we got a very stripped-down version of religion, which became very reliant on scriptural authority rather than on direct experience. I mean, after all, in the Middle Ages, most people didn't know anything about scriptural authority. The Bible readings and the services were in Latin. It appealed to the right brain. It was an experiential thing. It wasn't about left brain analytical logic. So I think if we one thing I would say is that we have to recover that sense of connection to tradition. And one way in which that is happening here in England and in other parts of Europe is through a revival of pilgrimage. There's been an astonishing revival of pilgrimage in Europe in the last 20 or 30 years. Most obviously in the case of Santiago in Spain, the Camino to Santiago to Compostela. In 1987, when the modern version of the pilgrimage got going, 1,000 people did it. Last year, about 300,000 people walked there. And here in Britain, there's a movement called the British Pilgrimage Trust that's reopening the old footpath pilgrimage routes. In Protestant countries like Britain and Scandinavia and North Germany, the Protestant reformers abolished pilgrimage. It was deliberately suppressed. So there's been a kind of vacuum there, which is now being filled by the revival of pilgrimage. So I think that's one way of reconnecting with sacred places and sacred histories. My own ideas of morphic resonance are that there's a kind of memories involved, and we can't, a part of a collective unconscious or archetypal patterns, we can't just wish them away. They're there, and it's a healthier thing to connect with them and relate to them in a positive way than to try and pretend they don't exist. in my experience, although many people's view of religion is that it's dogmatic, as an actual practicing member of the Church of England, which is our national church, which is halfway between Catholic and Protestant, it's sort of intermediate. It's much less Protestant than Lutheranism, but it's not as Catholic as the Roman Church because we have married priests and we have women priests and women bishops. But the liturgy is almost the same as the Roman Catholic liturgy. When I go to church and talk to people who go there, I mean, most people who go to church now in Britain are not going like sheep who've been herded into through fear of hell. I mean, they know that it's a minority pursuit. I mean, in the modern world, it's seen as it's a kind of minority. Most people see it as a kind of harmless hobby, a bit like breeding gerbils or something. Something that doesn't, as long as it doesn't affect anyone else, it's perfectly fine. So they know that it's eccentric to go to church. And there's a wide variety of views as to what various Christian doctrines mean, a real curiosity and exploration. Where I encountered dogmatism in the modern world is not in the context of religion. I don't meet fundamentalist Christians here in Britain. I'm sure they exist in America on a large scale, but not here. Where I encountered dogmatism is the minute I enter a scientific institute. Those are the most extreme forms of dogmatism, and intolerance, bigotry, refusal to discuss anything that doesn't fit into the worldview. And most scientists are actually more open-minded than dogmatic atheists would lead us to believe. But they don't dare talk about it to their colleagues usually, except late in the evening after a few glasses of wine or beer. Then it turns out that many scientists are much more open-minded than you might have thought. But they feel afraid to talk about that when they're at work because there is this terrible dogmatism within institutional science, much worse, in my opinion, than within institutional religion in Europe today.
In 1882, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that God was dead and that we had killed him. How can we return to God after God is dead, after atheism, after materialism? It seems to me that the way forward is not going back to some form of pre-scientific religious worldview. What do you think is the way forward?
Well, I think that the way forward doesn't obviously involve going back to a pre-scientific worldview. It involves forming a post-materialist worldview. But that post-materialist worldview, one has to acknowledge, has a lot in common with the pre-materialist worldview. It's like a higher turn of the spiral. It's not turning the clock back and going back to the year 1300 or something. That's impossible anyway. In a sense, I'm a radical traditionalist. I think that we need to retain a continuity with our traditions and liturgies. I go to church. I think it's important to retain this continuity with singing and chanting and this historical tradition, but always updating it and reinterpreting it, rather than just rejecting the whole thing. And for many people, religion is about doctrines which don't seem to connect with the natural world, and which have increasingly become detached from experience because it's become more book-based. And I think the true roots of all religions are through direct experience. That's exactly why in my book the emphasis is on spiritual practices, not on beliefs, but on practices, so that what they do is open up ways that people can have direct experiences of their connections with a more than human world.
Thank you for watching. Please join us for our next episode about modern science.